The Financial Sense Midweek Edition with Jim Paplava. Delving in depth with authors and experts into the key economic issues. Today's host is the senior editor for Financial Sense, Cris Sheridan.
In part one of my interview with James Castorius, we talked about Friedrich Hayek and a lot of his contributions, not just in economics, but also in political philosophy and in psychology, and a lot of the different ideas that he had brought to the table in some of his works and how influential he was. He had written a book that's considered perhaps one of the most influential for the 20th century. And he's a very, very interesting person. So I encourage you to listen to part one if you haven't. Part two, we're going to take up where we left off, talking about bubbles and the role that the central bank plays in that, whether or not they should be popping bubbles. And we're also going to get into a lot of other interesting ideas as well. So I hope you enjoy the second part of my interview with James Castorius on Friedrich Hayek. So it's interesting, we're talking about bubbles, and there's been a lot of talk about how the Fed needs to pop the market bubble as it currently exists, or that many people believe there's a bubble in the stock market today, and that the Fed should be raising interest rates to prevent a bubble from occurring. And, I think that's interesting because Yellen even said when she spoke at the IMF not too long ago, basically that that's not their job, or that for the central bank to try and pop bubbles by raising interest rates is too much of a blunt instrument. It's not precise enough. Basically how she argued it is that if you try to raise interest rates by bursting the stock market bubble or slowing the speed of the stock market, what you might end up doing is increasing unemployment much more than you would by slowing the stock market. Essentially, that the costs exceed the benefits.
I think the fact that Janet Yellen, who is sort of a middle-of-the-road economist, maybe, might slightly lean to the left, but basically the depth of the influence that Hayek has had on our economic culture can really be reflected in those words. Because what Yellen was saying, what she was articulating, is something that has become sort of a conventional wisdom, but which really wasn't conventional wisdom at the time that Hayek was writing, which is this idea that government or central bankers or government planners really are not in the best position to figure out what the proper price of things are. So first of all, Yellen is really saying a couple of different things. First of all, she's saying that the Fed doesn't really have the right instrument. In other words, the interest rate instrument is far too blunt. And by using that blunt instrument and trying to, let's say, pop bubbles in the cloud computing sector, you might end up hurting a lot of people in other sectors that are not in a bubble. So that's the sort of point that Hayek was making back in the 1930s, where actions that governments take have unintended consequences, because oftentimes the government doesn't have tools that can very precisely identify the problems that they've supposedly identified. But I think even more profound than that is that Hayek would say that central bankers or the government itself is not even in a position to know whether something is a bubble or not. In other words, it's not just that the government doesn't have the proper instruments to pop a bubble, it's that the government can't possibly know in advance if it's a bubble or not, because that would actually constitute a fatal conceit. Hayek said we have to let entrepreneurs figure out on their own what the best way is to solve these problems. If there's a lot of entrepreneurs and capitalists who are investing lots of money in new technologies, who is a central government bureaucrat to say that those investors are crazy or that they are engaging in malinvestment? The reality is that history tends to show that over time, the decisions made by individual entrepreneurs that have localized information that's dispersed, they tend to make superior decisions than, say, central government planners. So in relation to this question that you just asked, I think Hayek would say absolutely. It's not the business of government to be, for example, they shouldn't be doing either of two things. They shouldn't be overly favoring certain sectors over others and trying to create winners, but they also shouldn't be trying to pop bubbles. Because the reality is that government bureaucrats are not in the best position to understand what sectors actually constitute a bubble, what price is the proper price for a particular asset. These are not things that governments are actually very good at. Individual entrepreneurs are actually much better at this.
The ironic part about this, though, is that at the same time, you do have central bankers like Ben Bernanke, and perhaps even prior to him, speaking publicly about the wealth effect and using the stock market or assets, whether it be property prices, for example, housing, as a means to generate consumption. So I guess, from my view, there's an asymmetry there. On the one hand, they view the stock market, or let's say assets, as a means to try to get the economy going. Hopefully, I guess we could argue whether or not that's even taking place now. And that's one of the big questions we're facing right now. But on the other hand, once the stock market does get going, then at that point, they're much less likely then to put on the brakes because, this could cause a lot of damage. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I agree with that. I think that you could possibly make a distinction here, which is that it's one thing for, let's say, a central banker like Bernanke to say, if the general level of the stock market rises, let's say if the entire stock market sort of rises in value, the entire $20 trillion equity market in the United States tends to sort of rise across the board, then it might be at least plausible to think that the wealth effect might actually stimulate consumption. Now, we could argue, and people can reasonably argue, whether that's a good way to stimulate consumption or how much consumption it will stimulate, but it's more of a general proposition, the idea that if we increase people's perceived wealth, that they will tend to increase their consumption. That's a very different proposition than saying, hey, we have certain stocks in the tech sector or in biotech that are exploding upwards, and we need the government to come in and do something about that. Because that's more sector-specific knowledge, company-specific knowledge. And like I said before, I think Hayek and many other economists believe that, central planners and central bankers are not in a position to really judge, what prices specific stocks should be selling at relative to others. But I think there is a distinction between that type of quote-unquote central planning and the idea that if they successfully inflate the stock market as a whole, that might actually generate more consumption. So it's a little bit of a distinction in the argument, and we could certainly, again, have a very nice debate about whether it's actually appropriate or desirable in the long run for the central bank to intervene so much in the financial system and specifically for them to target asset prices in order to stimulate consumption. I think that's something that certainly Hayek would be highly skeptical of. But I think that there is a distinction between, let's say, that level of sort of top-down macroeconomic management and the type of management involved in trying to pick winners and losers, trying to burst bubbles in particular sectors or try to pick winners in other sectors of the economy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I guess maybe we should talk a little bit about how this relates to, the famed efficient market hypothesis, because this is, the EMH, or the efficient market hypothesis, has kind of been like the conventional economic view, I suppose. And I think that this was even a topic that Soros took up either explicitly or implicitly in his speech at the Cato Institute that, you gave a really good response to. Do you mind kind of tying in the EMH in all of this?
Yeah, that's a very important point, Chris, and it does tie in well to what we just talked about right now. I think that Soros sort of tried to associate Hayek with the efficient market hypothesis. Hayek never really addressed this specifically in his work, but it's pretty clear from his work that he would be highly skeptical of this idea of efficient market hypothesis. And this just had to do with his methodological subjectivism. What I mean by this is that he would be very skeptical of the idea that there is objectively a correct price for a given asset. A market is basically constitutes of opinions, different people's opinions about what assets are worth. And basically, it's a competitive environment where, people's opinions are sort of pitted against one another. But he would be highly skeptical of anybody's ability to correctly sort of pinpoint the exact objective value or the correct value of a particular stock or of a market or anything else, because that basically would involve perfect knowledge of the future, and you can't have that knowledge. You can't even have perfect knowledge of the present because of how dispersed all the information is that would be relevant to making decisions about the present. But if that's a problem in making present economic decisions, it's even more complicated to possibly imagine that, in the context of future decisions. So I think that in that sort of scenario, the market is simply composed of a lot of widely diverging opinions. There's no sort of objective benchmark that anybody can point to say, okay, the market or a stock needs to be valued at this level. And this suggests that it's always possible for markets to veer from being highly overvalued to highly undervalued, precisely because sort of people's perceptions and opinions about what constitutes value sort of change over time. And it's actually pretty much impossible a priori to sort of be able to declare that the way that the market is valuing an asset is wrong sort of on its face. So I think that that's an important insight that Hayek had. However, Hayek did believe that mispricings in the market would be fixed or would tend to be corrected by entrepreneurs. And in this case, the entrepreneurs of the market are investors like you and me, who basically look at the stock market on a day-to-day basis. We look at individual stocks, we look at sectors, we look at the market, and we all possess certain types of knowledge, and each of us acting individually are trying to take advantage of some of these mispricings. And Hayek would certainly say, yeah, there's probably some people that have better information than others, that are probably smarter than others, that have better analytical techniques, and some of those people will probably be able to take advantage of this situation. However, he would be very cautious. He would say, look, 99% of people are not going to probably be able to do better than what let's say what a general index fund would do. He would probably accept that proposition simply because to think that you can actually do better or to know more than what, let's say, what the market is reflecting in prices is sort of a fatal conceit. It's a statement on your part that you think that you're smarter than what the market is. Now, I think Hayek would recognize that, yeah, at any given point in time, there are some people in the market that are actually smarter than the market is at that particular time, or some people that have superior ability to process information and that they are able to identify mispricings and therefore take advantage of them. And in that sense, he would be running against the efficient market hypothesis, because the efficient market hypothesis posits that individual investors are not simply are incapable of spotting mispricings in the market. I think Hayek would highly unlikely to have agreed with that view. I think he's more likely to have thought that the market is a competitive venue where people with differing abilities and differing information and different levels of skill get together, and through this competitive process, assets become priced more efficiently than if a central planner was actually telling us what the price of Apple should be on any given day or what the price of IBM should be on any given day. But for this competitive process to actually work, we actually have to have differing opinions. In other words, people's opinions have to be pitted against one another. And for the process to work, we have to actually have really smart people, really capable people, where they're actually able to make money by actually determining or calculating more effectively the price of financial assets than other people. So I think that Hayek would say, yes, there are some people that in any given circumstance may have superior information, ability to process that information, and they can therefore take advantage of market mispricing. Then he would say, if you have that information, you should go right ahead and do it. But I think he would also warn people, you need to be very careful in thinking that you have, let's say, a superior ability to determine the proper price of things than the market itself. Because you're basically putting yourself in the position of a central government planner, so to speak, in saying that you have a better ability than the market to properly price assets. And he would say you need to be very careful about that.
You know, I would say that this kind of goes to the idea delineating between, the sort of wisdom of the crowd versus, the mob tendencies of the crowd. And it sounds like, Hayek through a lot of his work, was articulating more of the wisdom aspect, that you have a large number of participants, each interacting, and their collective decision-making yield this sort of spontaneous order, and that's what the economy, that's what the market essentially is. It's not this top-down, centrally planned process, but it is a bottom-up organic process that results from all these little parts, working interdependently. Now, I guess the key thing is to understand that at times the crowd goes from a sort of collective decision-making, perhaps wise entity of bringing about the most efficient allocation of resources or even pricing of information to something that is more mob-like, and where you see herding take place, and swinging between perhaps these extremes of manias and, just rampant fear. So I guess, maybe Hayek would see that both of those processes take place, and it's not a static process. It's not this sort of equilibrium, but there is this sort of tendency to swing from one to the other. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would make two comments. First, Hayek, his thought evolved in that regard. He, at early career, was somewhat attracted to the idea of equilibrium. Later on in his career, he essentially abandoned that idea and actually became more critical of it. He believed that, equilibrium was probably, was only a hypothetical state. And not only would probably never be achieved, but you couldn't even figure out where it should be. So I think that was an important evolution in his thought that he experienced over, an extremely long career. Hayek was very big on what he would call rules of general application. Hayek was very much against giving government officials power to determine how best to do certain things in a given situation. He was in favor of setting very clear but very general and broad rules that had to, that always had to be followed, and that gave market participants a lot of leeway. And what this means, if this free interplay of the market actually led to bubbles sometimes or led to crashes sometimes, then that was part of the, let's say, of the learning process. That was part of this organic process towards wealth creation. And we had to be sort of willing to pay that, as a society, we had to be willing to sort of pay the price of that in order to create greater prosperity. If we actually created a government system that was created specifically to always try to prevent these kinds of swings, then we would probably be less prosperous in the long run. Hayek would also say, look, a free society is so precious, and the institutions of a free society are so precious because they have created prosperity, that we have to make them politically viable and sustainable over the long run. And so too much instability in the economy is probably not a good thing. In other words, if we have an economy that every time we go into a recession, we have 20 or 30% unemployment, people out on the streets, that is not going to build enough consensus and enough support for a free market system. People will end up rejecting that and go towards a more communist or a more socialist type of system, and a more interventionist system to prevent, that kind of instability. So Hayek said, look, we need to I think he would say, that's why we probably need some level of welfare state to be able to lessen the blow and to lessen the impact of the volatility that comes about in a capitalist system. Because even though in the abstract or in theory, just letting the market do what it wanted to do on its own might potentially lead to, a faster economic growth and better outcomes in the long run. The reality is that the true reality is that it won't, because politically it won't be viable. We probably need to design certain types of institutions that provide sort of a backstop for, the unfortunate people that are affected in, economic downturns, in rough times and in bad times. And that'll provide sort of the political basis and the sufficient level of political and societal stability that's necessary for a free market system to really flourish.
And I guess that would be, just like a safety net, for example. I mean, we could look at, the Federal Reserve as a central bank as being a lender of last resort, Social Security, unemployment insurance, those kind of things, correct? Is that kind of what he would look at?
Exactly. Unemployment insurance, some sort of minimal provision of health care, not necessarily Obamacare, but, some level of, maybe similar to, sort of what Medicaid is in the United States, poor people that just cannot afford, or maybe let's say a national insurance plan that provided some minimal level of care for people and make sure that, people don't fall through the cracks, that sort of thing. He would really want to try to limit that and, not, let's say, allow that, the level of government intervention to grow too much, because that would actually, sort of impair the dynamism of the system. But I do think that he believed that in order to secure enough societal support for free institutions, that some modicum or some level of welfare state policies would probably be necessary. And so in that sense, that's one reason why Hayek is actually very much disliked and even hated by some sort of modern Austrians or people in the Austrian School of Economics, or let's say libertarians or very, really, really right-wing people in the United States have actually that actually understand Hayek and know what he's written, actually don't like Hayek at all, because he has made what they consider these concessions. But from Hayek's point of view, these are empirical concessions, or these are pragmatic concessions. In fact, in his view, they're not concessions at all. They're just a recognition of reality, at least from his point of view, which is that he believes that the market system will provide the greatest amount of prosperity in the long term. But you need to establish the right kind of political and social conditions so that that kind of system can flourish in the long run. And he just believed that if you just allowed, again, if you had a country or a system where inevitably you're going to have, in a capitalist system, you're going to have recessions, you're going to have downtime. Every time something like that happened, you had massive amounts of people getting thrown out on the streets. Eventually, that system wasn't going to be sustainable. Eventually, people would adopt a socialistic or communistic type of model. And so he felt that the best way to actually enable a free market system to flourish over the long term was actually to at least provide some level of minimal social welfare for people, and sort of a minimal social, or let's say a minimal welfare state that would enable, the right type of broad-based social and political support for the economic system.
One last thing I wanted to point out that too, when you were talking about how Hayek would concede that bubbles will occur within a free market system, and that, we shouldn't try to eliminate them because they're probably part of this, maybe one could call it a Schumpeterian creative destruction process, maybe we could say. But I guess what came to mind when you were talking about that is, just like if you were to play a football game, in football, everyone loves to watch football. Clearly people are getting hurt all the time, right? I mean, you have players that they know going into the game that there is the risk that they might end up, getting a head injury or breaking a leg. It's kind of part of the game. But at the same time, we wouldn't expect the referees or someone else to be preventing the game from being played because of that risk. So like you're saying, there has to be some guidelines, some rules, a framework that is enforced, clear guidelines that are being enforced for the game itself to be played effectively. And if you try to, overly manage that process and affect anyone from getting hurt, and let's say if that would be a bubble in that case, well then, you can't play the game. And that's kind of part of what we see in the market.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. I think Hayek, even though he wasn't much of a sports guy, there's no question that sport analogies would be, he would tend to agree with him, because one of the things about sports is that you have general rules that are generally applicable. You don't have referees in the middle of the game making decisions about, for example, holding is holding in football, right? Referees, they can make mistakes and sometimes they see things wrong or whatever, but the same rules apply universally to everybody. And so, if one guy is let's say holding, like the referee throws the flag, and if the other team, is holding, he throws out the flag. The referee doesn't say, oh, well, this team is losing, and this guy's holding, so I'm not going to throw the flag now because the team is losing, type of thing. That doesn't happen in football and doesn't happen in sports. In sports, for example, if the ball is out of bounds in tennis, if it's over the line, it's out. The referee doesn't make arbitrary decisions to let play continue even though the ball already is out of bounds. So this type of very strict rules of general applicability is exactly the type of rules that Hayek favored. And definitely what he didn't favor and what he believed would be extremely harmful would be is if we gave too much power to referees to say, okay, well, they can call something out of bounds some plays and not out of bounds on other plays. Or let's say some plays like to protect the quarterback and so the quarterback doesn't get injured, we'll allow referees to call that play sometimes and not call it on other times. That would be bad. However, just to take this one final step, if rules are adopted to protect players and they are generally applied, I think by the same sort of Hayekian principle, if you will, Hayek would say as long as the rule is generally applied and it applies to everybody equally, then in principle it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad rule. So in football, if a rule is adopted that doesn't allow you to spear, which it means that you use your helmet to initiate contact with another player, if referees apply that rule generally, and that's a rule that's meant to actually protect players from, getting neck injuries, then, that's an acceptable rule. But what wouldn't be acceptable is for referees to have a lot of discretion where, again, on one play, a player charges with his head and spears a player and the penalty is called, and then in another situation it's not called. That wouldn't be the right. So I think the sports analogy is actually quite good.
In talking about this risk that comes about with bubbles, Jim Poplava, my boss, when he was around in 1998, he saw, people that were in their 70s and 80s demanding that he put them into the really, really strongly performing tech stocks of the day, AOL or, whatever, pets.com, and because he didn't do that, they would end up leaving his business because, they wanted to be in those stocks. And so, when you have people doing that, because it's so hard not to want to, it's just this herd mentality of barreling into the bubble. When you have all these people that are putting their savings and their wealth into stocks during a bubble, well, when it crashes, that's the bad part, and of course, that's a terrible thing. And I almost think, and I've heard this talked about before, but, I don't know if this would ever happen or if this is even a good idea. And I would love to hear what you think about this and perhaps, what Hayek's point of view would be on this. But if we were to somehow limit stock ownership to people of a certain net worth, such that, we kind of eliminated some of the risks that could come about to people barreling into a bubble at the wrong time, which from my point of view almost seems to happen just every time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And it's really interesting where a society or a government, should draw the line in protecting people from themselves. And to some extent, this is a democratic issue, and that can be solved through legislative means, and in other ways, it's more of a basic sort of let's say rights or more fundamental issue because you have too much paternalism where you're trying to protect the people from themselves. You're obviously going to potentially go get into a situation where you're going to be impinging upon the free interplay of economic forces that can create prosperity in the long run. I think that there are some, for example, some things that I think would be possible improvements to the market. Myself, I don't know that. I'm just going to speak for myself here because it's hard to really sort of guess what Hayek's opinion would be on it. But for example, one area that I have thought of, and I'm not absolutely positive that I would implement this, but somewhat along the lines of what you're talking about, is that I really wonder to what extent we need commodity-oriented ETFs, for example, like U.S. oil ETF.
Right, which doesn't even track the price of oil that well anyways.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem with that is that it adds a speculative premium to the price of oil and adds volatility to the price of a crucial commodity such as oil. The people who are buying the ETFs, obviously, they're not doing this to make any kind of economic use of the oil commodity. They're not planning to take delivery of the oil. They're not planning to use it themselves. People buy these ETFs purely for speculative purposes, and it introduces a significant amount of volatility in global oil prices, and that volatility probably creates certain economic inefficiencies, in addition to kind of creating this issue that you're pointing out, which is that a lot of people end up losing money speculating on commodities that, probably don't need to be speculating on commodities. So I wonder really whether we should have ever allowed the creation of ETFs to track commodities, because it's hard to really see how that's really benefiting anybody. And I don't think it's making the market for oil more efficient. It's not going to make people any wealthier. It's basically giving people another outlet to gamble. I mean, and gambling is fine, but maybe we should have people gambling in Las Vegas and not with the price of oil, which is something that really has all kinds of, let's say, secondary effects. It has all kinds of spillover effects on the broader economy when we have people speculating on oil rather than people that want to go and speculate on craps on a table in Las Vegas. So I think there is some room to debate these types of issues, and I think Hayek was a pragmatic sort of a guy, and I think he would admit of the possibility at least to bring this within the scope of debate. I wouldn't venture a guess as to exactly what he would say about these issues. Now, I think to your particular point, I think that, investment advisors have a very challenging job for the very reason that you point out. In other words, individual investors tend to want to invest in things at the very wrong time, and they want to sell things at the wrong time. And I guess the art and the challenge involved in being a good investment advisor is in trying to educate clients, and more than just educate them in an intellectual sense. It's actually prepare them emotionally ahead of time for these situations that are going to present themselves, so that when the situation does present itself, which it will, hopefully they'll remember what you talked to them about. So, for example, you'll say, look, there's going to come a time when stocks are going to crash, and you're going to call me wanting to sell because you're afraid. But you know what? At that particular point in time, I'm going to actually tell you that I think that rather than selling what you've got, you ought to be buying more. You explain that to the client, and you talk to them about that over and over again before it actually happens. So that the day it does happen, it doesn't mean that the client isn't going to be sort of tempted to want to sell everything in the portfolio right at the bottom of the market. He is going to be tempted. But I think that the advisor has a much better shot at convincing the client if they have already sort of committed verbally in advance that if something like that happened, that they wouldn't just sell out and in fact would buy. I realize that this is something that advisors, struggle with and they deal with all the time, and individual investors deal with it. But I do think that this is part of the market process. It's part of, wide participation in financial markets is an important, let's say, element or ingredient to the prosperity of the United States. The depth of our capital markets is one of the United States' key competitive advantages in the world. And so I would be very hesitant to sort of start restricting access to capital markets to individual investors despite these dangers, because on the aggregate, even those small investors, each one of their investments individually doesn't mean much. On the aggregate, all of the small investments by all these small individual investors actually provide a significant amount of capital to the capital market. So I think that maybe the issue is, how can the financial industry do a better job of educating investors, of preparing investors psychologically? And I think that what some of the individual investors, listening to your show, should really think about their relationship with their advisor, possibly less in terms of what they think, how great of a stock picker they think their advisor is, or how great they think the advisor is at timing the market and so forth. Obviously, that's very important. But I think that ideally, the most important thing that an advisor can do for a client over the course of a long relationship is more psychological in nature. It's more of a counseling function. It's more of a don't panic now. Right now is not the time to panic and sell. Right now is the time to buy more. You see, because while everybody's rushing out, what we should be doing is the exact opposite, is then buying. And if you as a client have established that kind of relationship and trust with your particular advisor, you're probably more likely to make good decisions. And maybe what clients need to be looking for when they're looking for a financial advisor is the type of individual that's going to give them that kind of coaching. In other words, pick a good coach. Don't necessarily pick a guy that you think is a great stock picker, because that coach is probably the guy that's going to help you, or the woman that's going to help you when the chips are down and when things are really emotional. For example, in the middle of a bubble, like the tech bubble where everybody was making money by buying tech stocks, that's the time where you want that advisor to kind of tamp down your enthusiasm and say, you know what, we're going to let these people make this money because this is not going to end well. We're going to allow people to make money in the next, few months or whatever, but we're not going to risk our own capital and our own future on this kind of speculative stuff. And by the same token, when, the market has just crashed and stocks are cheap, that this advisor is going to be aggressively, trying to advise you and try to coach you into, making the right decisions at the time. I realize that what I'm saying is, it doesn't have anything to do with economic policy and it doesn't have anything to do with Hayek per se, but what it has to do with is that these types of decisions that are made in the economy are made sort of at an individual level, and hopefully individuals, if they're investing on their own, they pay attention to the psychological aspects of investing, because that aspect of investing for most individual investors is far more important than, let's say, the technical aspects of investing in terms of understanding PE ratios and understanding a lot of other sort of, let's say, more specific pieces of financial knowledge. So whether it be individual investors on their own or in conjunction with an advisor, individual investors need to spend, I'd say, at least as much time preparing emotionally for situations and, let's say, strengthening their emotional ability to navigate the markets than they do on, let's say, trying to become expert stock pickers, which is probably unlikely anyway, because the truth of the matter is that most individual investors are not really going to be competitive against the Warren Buffetts of the world, against top investors that have, staffs of 30 guys working for them and, research at their disposal and a lot of things. It's really tough to win a game, for an individual investor to win that kind of game against professional investors. But where individual investors can potentially win the game is that there are situations where markets move into panic, where even professionals are even forced to sell because their clients are selling. In other words, professional investors, that have a fund, if the owners of those shares are telling them they are cashing in, then they're forced to sell. Or maybe, professional investors got too leveraged or whatever. There's any number of reasons why both professional and non-professional investors make irrational decisions in the course of a bear market. And that's where an individual investor, if he's emotionally prepared, he or she is emotionally prepared, can really gain an edge. And there's going to be a few opportunities in their lifetime, not many. It's not going to happen every year, but there's a few opportunities over the course of the lifetime of an individual investor where they will have some opportunity to take advantage of these, major swings in the markets that happen and that cause people to make bad decisions. And if they're zigging where everybody else is zagging, if they're making the right decisions where other people are making the wrong decisions, they will really outperform the market in the long run, and they'll be able to build wealth. And I guess that, just to wrap up, I'd say that is how I would approach the problem rather than trying to legislate the issue away.
I think that's a really good point. And one last question. If you were to recommend one, or, we could even say maybe two books that our listeners should read if they haven't read any of Hayek's work, what book would you recommend?
Yeah, I think this one, he wrote so much, but there's no question in my mind, at least, that the one book that everybody should just read, period, it should be on everybody's mandatory reading list, is The Road to Serfdom. That's a book that had a tremendous influence, one of the most influential books of the 20th century. So it's actually important to read it just almost from a historical perspective, just because this book was so influential. You want to know kind of what the big deal was, why was this book influential, but also because the book, it just contains a great deal of wisdom and it's highly accessible to the public. It's not a book that is highly technical, that requires a lot of economic knowledge. It's a book that any sort of educated individual, without any great economic background is able to read and to appreciate. So first and foremost, I would say that's the one book by Hayek that I would recommend for people to read. After that, Hayek wrote a lot of other things And I think that the best way for people to introduce themselves to further to, say, Hayek's work would be by going on the internet and sort of surfing around under Hayek and sort of reading some of the summaries of his other works and sort of seeing what people might be interested in, because he did write about so many different things. And maybe by just researching a little bit on the internet, people could actually sort of find a niche or find sort of specific things that Hayek wrote about that they might be interested in reading.
Well, James, thanks for coming on and providing such an interesting, insightful discussion about Hayek. If people wanted to read some of your work, I know that you write at Seeking Alpha on a fairly regular basis. The piece that Soros wrote is there, and I know your response to him was also published at Seeking Alpha, Misperceptions About Hayek, a response to Soros. Would that be the best way for people to follow your work, or is there any other method?
The best way, actually, for people to follow my work is to go to jamescostories.com. It's James, and then my last name is spelled K-O-S, as in Sam, T-O-H-R-Y-Z.com. And if they go to that site, they'll be asked to sign up to my mailing list, which basically whenever I publish an article, and I don't publish articles that often, but whenever I do publish an article, whether it be on Seeking Alpha, whether it be on Market Watch or other venues, my subscribers to this free list will always be sure to be the first people to get it. So I recommend that people go to jamescostories.com, just sign up for my free newsletter. And basically, whatever I happen to publish, they'll be able to get it.
And I see at your site, you actually have our last interview listed there. So if you want to listen to that, you can easily do that as well. Once again, that's his first and last name, James, J-A-M-E-S, Kostories, K-O-S-T-O-H-R-Y-Z. And that's .com. Well, James, thank you again for coming on, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much, Chris.
So that concludes part 2 with my interview with James Kostories on Friedrich Hayek. Once again, Friedrich Hayek is really an intellectual giant. He's made a massive impression, and he's left a footprint on so many different fields, whether it's economics, whether it's political philosophy, or even psychology, with his book, The Sensory Order, which neuroscientists are still discussing today. There's so much about this man and so many different theories and thoughts that he had, and it was hard to sum all of it up in one interview, which is why we broke this up into 2 parts. So if you haven't read The Road to Serfdom, which was the book that James Kostories had recommended, it's a phenomenal book. It's very well written. And like James had said, it really helps even describe the atmosphere during that time in which it was written, when socialism was really starting to take over, sweeping across Europe. And Hayek sort of foresaw where this was all headed. And, many of the things that Hayek warned about we are facing today. When we look at the markets, we see a strongly intervening central bank. We see a very strongly intervening central government. Clearly, this debate between Keynes and Hayek took place during the Great Depression. It was not just an isolated event. And these are ongoing themes that we're facing, and it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. I'm Cris Sheridan. You've been listening to Financial Sense News Hour at financialsense.com.